All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Jevac, and I am with the Fralin Museum of Art at the University of Virginia. And I would like to welcome everyone for joining us for the 8th webinar in this series, where the Fralin and the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection, which are both museums at the University of Virginia, are investigating art forms that don't typically show up in the museum. We believe that there are many art forms that are culturally dense, deeply tied to identity, and formally and technically complex that deserve our attention. Often these are taken for granted because they are part of our daily lives and aren't highlighted or labeled as deserving our full attention. So with the Art in Life, we are giving these art forms the attention they deserve. All right, so now I would like to introduce my colleague from the Kluge-Ruhe, Margot Smith.
Hi, everybody. Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge that the Kluge-Ruhe and the Fralin are located on the land of the Monacan Nation and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And since we're all joining from locations around the world, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous nations where each of us are located, and we encourage you, if you don't know who the Indigenous people are where you live, that you find out and learn about them and their art and culture. I also want to thank our sponsors, UVA Arts Council and the Vice Provost for the Arts at UVA. The subject tonight is knitting, which is near and dear to my heart. I also want to show you the garment I'm wearing and give a shout out to Underwood artist Coraline Whiskey. She did this project in collaboration with Warhol Australia based on her painting style. And I take great joy in wearing it, and especially in wearing it tonight, and saying hi to our friends at Awancha in the Northern Territory where Coraline works. So we're going to begin with each panelist speaking for about 5 minutes about their own relationship with knitting and why it's important to them. Following that, we'll have a few questions that we're going to pose to the speakers, and then we'll open it up for the audience questions in the Q&A. So I'm very happy to introduce our first panelist, the founder of Brooklyn Boy Knits, Louis Boria. Spotted knitting on a New York City subway, Boria catapulted into the spotlight, where he has not only been able to turn his pastime into a career, but has also expanded the popular idea of who is a knitter. Welcome, Louis.
Thank you, Margot, for the introduction. And I want to thank both you and Lisa for inviting me on tonight's panel. I'm super excited to be here, and it's a great honor to be able to speak to all the attendees here today. And I guess I should begin from the very beginning. If you don't know the story and how it all started with knitting, for me, I talk about the big dream that I had back in 2008. And I know it sounds really cliche, and I know we spoke about this last night in our meeting, but I'm gonna tell the folks tonight a little bit about how my career started. So back in 2008, I had this dream of knitting. Now, prior to the dream, there was no interest in wanting to learn how to knit, or I was not even interested in the fiber arts. When I was about 14 years old, my grandmother, my late grandmother, Josephine, was an avid crochet artist, and she made blankets and you name it. She made toilet seat covers and toilet paper covers. She did it all. And she would gift all her items that she crocheted to just friends and family. And I remember that stuck with me, throughout the years. So that was my only real connection with the fiber arts at that time. And I remember at 14, she insisted on teaching me how to crochet. And just to entertain the thought, and I wanted to please my grandmother at the time, I said, you know what, why not? Let's do it. And so I spent the whole afternoon, and she taught me how to crochet. And as quick as I picked up that hook was as quick as I put it down that same day. And I never looked back until 2008. And I had this dream, and in that dream, it just felt so real to me. And I woke up laughing and said, well, maybe this is a sign. Maybe this is something that I should follow. And sure enough, I decided to go to Michael's arts and crafts store that same day and pick up some needles, some yarn, and came home and started watching YouTube videos on how to knit. And what surprised me was that I picked it up so fast, and it was so entertaining, and it was so therapeutic. And if you knit, or if you crochet, or even if you're into the fiber arts, there's something therapeutic about it, right? And I even talk to indie dyers a lot about how they connect to the fiber, right? And it's a form of therapy. It's a form of escape, and that's where my journey really started. I used it as my escape mechanism. I lived in New York all my life. I was born and raised in New York, in Brooklyn. And it's a big city, and it could be a little stressful. So as I became an adult, the everyday life just started weighing on me. And I remember at that time, I came to a crossroads where there was bumps in the road, and didn't really know what I was supposed to be doing in my life other than going to a 9 to 5. And I felt like there had to be more to life than that. And so, with my knitting project always with me, I started expanding and learning more and more in the fiber arts and what fibers were out there. And I realized that the industry itself was so vast and so big that there was so much to learn. And so in 2017, I started having wanting to knit in public, and I had this huge fear of wanting to knit in public, for the fear of, well, here's a guy, and it's traditionally done by women, it's traditionally done by older women. And that stuck with me. And for years, before 2017, it was this thing where I had to overcome. And it was until one day I got stuck on a train. I had my project in my bag, and I knit at home in the comfort of my home, and would knit at work in the conference room when nobody's around. And this one day we're stuck in the train, and it's now 15 minutes past. And I'm like, all right, this train is not moving. People are on their cell phones reading books. And I just decided, you know what, just forget about it. Put your fears to the side. You got a project in your bag. You're just wasting time. And what I realized was that the whole time during this process of me being afraid and what are people going to say, I realized that I blacked out. And when I say black out, I talk about how, as we're working on our projects, whether you're passionate about something, it could be painting, it could be anything. But you get so in tune with what you're doing that you forget about what's around you. And at that moment, I realized that I had forgotten where I was. And when I looked up, there were people looking at me, but it wasn't looks of like, ooh, look at him. He's doing something that's considered girly, right? And I'm just giving you an example. And I realized people were smiling, and a woman came to me and she says, "It's so nice to see a young man knitting." And it was in that moment that things started to shift for me. And I realized, all this time I'm thinking that, society's going to look at me a certain way because I am a male, and I'm doing a craft that's traditionally done by women. In fact, it was quite the opposite. And it was me that put those walls up because I was afraid. And from there, it expanded. And then 2017 hit. And at this time, I started creating my own designs. And Brooklyn Boy Knits was created through my first website that I had created, where it was just a showcase of all my pieces that I was making. And then one day I get on the train, and lo and behold, someone snaps a photo of me on the train knitting. Had no idea that it was Frenchie Davis, who was a former contestant on American Idol, and later on went on to Broadway, had taken this photo of me knitting, and the photo went viral. And from that moment on, and I won't go too much into the details, but from that moment on, I realized that I had an opportunity to do something unique with my platform, right? So often we see people go viral for so many reasons. And I realized that the world is looking at me at this moment, and I need to take that moment and do something positive. And so rather than take it in for myself, I decided to give back to the community. And I started working with children. In the New York City public school system, and started working with organizations like Hat Not Hate, which is an anti-bully campaign. And I started devoting more of my time into that and teaching children how to knit and working with cancer patients at the hospital that I was working at in New York City at Mount Sinai Hospital. And I realized that there was something unique happening where not only was I passing on this craft that I love so much, but it was more than that. With the volunteers that I was, bringing together to help me teach these students, to help me teach patients at the hospital, to help me organize the events that we were doing surrounding anti-bullying campaigns, I realized that we were uniting not only knitters, but the love and the craft of it to others. And I talk about this one moment where we were teaching about 300 students. We had 25 volunteers teaching 300 students how to knit. And at one moment I took a step back and I realized what was happening, and seeing volunteers that never met each other that are meeting each other for the first time, are exchanging numbers at the end. And I'm just saying, wow, this is so amazing. This is so cool. Who would have thought that knitting would do something so positive and bring people together? And I realized that work was so important to me. And it's the work that I continue to this day. I have a love for this industry. I have a love for this art. We talk about, well, is knitting really art? It is. And I have this conversation quite often with folks about, when you're creating garments, it takes time, it takes math. When I'm designing scarves, or I'm designing a dress, or I'm designing a sweater, it's all mathematical. It's all about color. It's all about texture. It's about the fiber that we use. There are so many different fibers out there in our industry that till this day, I still learn more and more about it. And the combination of these fibers creates the most beautiful fabric. And I think that's what I really love about it the most. And I look back at when I started in 2008, and, I would have never, had I not followed that dream, I wouldn't be where I am today, creating and designing the way I am, and just loving the craft more than anything. But for me, what was bigger was that the bigger take on this is that I was able to see something different, something unique that I didn't know existed in this craft, which was, bringing communities together, and a lot of my work stems from that, right? So, we talk about how now in the industry we are, we're seeing things as racism happening within the industry. And when we started seeing these things happening in our industry, many of us, took a step back and had to look at this as a bigger picture. And Vogue Knitting magazine, which is one of the biggest publications in the US and pretty much internationally, where they reached out and said, we want to do something positive. We want to do something for this community and talk about these issues. And so they created the first ever diversity advisory council within the industry. And I have I have the honor to be a part of, the council. And in that, we make sure that, the look and feel of the magazine is being represented by everybody, because at a point there wasn't that representation. We didn't see as many BIPOC designers being featured in these magazines. So, seeing that come to play, and to see that happening now, there's a lot of work happening within our industry right now, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and coming on tonight, I wanted to talk about, these things with the folks, and just to really highlight, how our industry is growing, how our industry continues to grow each and every day.
Louis, that's great. We just hold that thought, because we want to explore some of that in the discussion.
All right, cool. All right, I don't want to overstep.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. You're very thorough, and it's given us a lot to talk about and a lot to consider. Okay, we're gonna now. I would like to introduce. I'm really excited to introduce and welcome micro knitter Althea Crome. Her micro knitting seems to defy what's humanly possible. Those of us who knit have an inkling of how difficult this might be. But these marvelous creations are just enthralling, and I'm thrilled to see Crome's creativity and sheer technical virtuosity. So I'd like to turn it over to Althea and welcome her.
Thank you so much, and to both of you, Margot and Lisa, and looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say as well. So let's just get started with the most extreme thing that I've done so far, my itty bitty teeny tiny, very micro. These are probably the most extreme things that I do. And with these, I like to try to get about 80 stitches per inch. And I have to make my own needles. They're about 0.01 inch diameter, which is about 0.25 millimeters. And I use silk thread. So why do I do it? Because I love a challenge, and I get an idea in my head and I just want to see if I can do it. So in the next slide, you'll see this is how an object I see that I think is beautiful can translate into a garment. So I was very inspired by the Greek amphoras that we have at the museum here at IU. And I was taking my 4 children there a long time ago. And I just saw that they were these figural, beautiful shapes. And I just saw the sweater sort of, you know, it's got the neck and the arms and the foot. So I couldn't wait to start designing and create this sculptural form. My knitting, I feel, is a small sculpture, and it is meant to be seen as a 3-dimensional object and looked at in 360 degrees, so all the way around. And I love gloves. So a lot of times if I have a design that I like, I will apply it to gloves as well. So the next slide is another version of seeing a beautiful object and wanting to translate that into the art that I love, which is miniature knitting. This is based on a nativity scene, a triptych in the Met. And again, when I saw that triptych, of course, it's got the back panel and the 2 front panels. And I wanted to translate that as well. There's cabling along the edges sort of to represent the frame. And what I try to do when I create a little garment is I want all aspects, the hem, the neckline, the collar. I want those to reflect the theme of the piece. And this piece has 12 18-karat gold buttons that were hand turned by a very dear friend of mine. And each one of those buttons represents the month, 1 month that it took me to make. So this took me 12 months to make. In the next slide, you'll see some more traditional kinds of things. They're still very tiny, but I like to study other kinds of knitting as well. Not every single thing I do has an image. Cables are incredible. They can be there's a huge variation of them. And the neat thing about fishermen's sweaters or Aran sweaters is that those cables represent different parts of a fisherman's life, like ropes or fish or moss. I don't know what all the symbols mean, but what I remember hearing is that, like, if a fisherman washed ashore, they could often tell what clan or family he came from by the patterns on his sweater, because they're very identifiable. So the next slide is an example of a personal narrative. So this is a story I wanted to tell about a trip. I went scuba diving one day and saw all kinds of magical things, like a water spout. So that's on the back, and that's actually cabled and twisted. Dolphins followed us out that day, and there were sharks and there was a rainbow. And then I lost my weight belt, so I had to go looking for it. And so I'm on the back and my dive master, George, is on the front there, and we're looking for it, and we did find it. And again, the collar, I wanted that to look like a barrel sponge. So I learned how to create this twisted knit, and the same goes for the bottom. So I wanted those, the hem and the cuffs to represent the waves of the ocean. Those buttons are made by another friend of mine, and they're silver and enamel. So as you know, my technique grows, I very rarely repeat something, but every now and then I'll feel like I could do that sweater better. And so in the next slide, you'll see my Warhol 2.0. And there's a little video here. I had the vision of creating the pockets that came to my mind first. And I just wanted everyone to see it's like a real pocket. I took out a little mitten. And so I would like to, everything I make has to work. The buttons work and have buttonholes. So about 10 years ago, I made a version of this, and my skill level was to the point where I could get about 4 Maryland faces on the back. And so I really wanted to do it again with the 9 faces. And my skill and ability over the years had improved to the point where I could do that. The last piece that I've made in miniature recently is based on Van Gogh's Starry Night. And when people ask how long it took to make this, I say it's 20 years in the making, because I've had this vision of this sweater in my brain for 15 years, but I knew I couldn't do it justice. I had to come up with some new techniques in order to really get a painterly look to it, for the colors to blend together the way I wanted them to. And you'll see on the right, there's in the background, you can see my chart. And so when I knit, I always knit with my computer on my lap. And then I almost always change as I go. Like when I cook, I can't follow a recipe. When I knit, I pretty much can't even follow my own chart. So I'm constantly changing it. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, but I don't like to have seams in my sweater. So I do it so that I have as few seams as possible. I try to, even though I'm not knitting in the round here, I did knit in the round around the collar and the shoulders, but I attach I knit my sleeves first, and then I attach my sleeves so that the continuity of the image isn't interrupted by seams. And in the next slide, I just want to give you a little bit of a sort of inside view of what I did to create my thread paints or my thread palette. So those are very fine silk thread spools, and I separated them. So if one was a 2-ply, I separated those plies and then I combined them together and mixed them. And this whole thing took me a couple of months, just creating this thread palette. And then I had to, of course, knit a sampler so I could see what those colors would look like together. And then finally, for something a little different, I really enjoyed working on the movie Coraline, which was a stop motion animated movie out in 2009. I worked on it for 2 years. I knit Coraline's star sweater, and that required a thread quest of epic proportion because it had to sparkle. And, you know, when I first started knitting these sweaters for the director, he said it was too fine. I had to make it bulkier because on screen, when you're doing something for film, it has to read like a sweater. So I ended up using, it's much, you know, it's much larger than something I would normally do. And then I made her gloves as well. So I made about 5 pairs of gloves and about 14 sweaters for each one of the sets. And then lastly, I love my community in Bloomington, Indiana, and I've been involved in several community art projects with my best friend Yara. On the left, you'll see one of the big brains that Jill Bolte Taylor had artists make. She created 22 of these 5-foot fiberglass brains, and then different artists did what they will with them. Yara and I did this one. She created the mohawk, and those are MRI images of her daughter's brain, and I created the brain cozy, lobe of the brain is a different color. And then on the right, that is a tree cozy that Yara and I made together as well. And that went to benefit one of the women's shelters here in town. So that wraps it up.
Thank you, Althea. That is really wonderful. Our next speaker is Lauren MacElroy, of Mother of Purl. MacElroy explores every aspect of the knitting process from farm to yarn and is keenly attuned to building opportunities for learning and personal expression in the patterns they design. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here with such amazing artists. So thank you for having me. I am engaged in the yarn arts from fleece to fabric, which means that I process raw sheep's wool, I dye it, I spin it into yarn, and I design knitwear. Knitting is the most satisfying feeling for my hands to be doing. When I'm knitting, I feel a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that my hands are performing the task that they most enjoy. Everything about the needles, the yarns, and the colors passing through my hands feels right. I love the texture of knit fabric, the way it feels, the way it flows, the way it holds warmth, and being able to have a hand in every step of the process. I really enjoy being able to strip things down to their essence and do them from start to finish. Knitting is art because of the amount of thought and skill that goes into it at every step of the process. From the careful considerations of the farmer and the relationship of the land and the animals, to the color in the dyeing process, with all of the variables. It takes so much time to get good at dyeing wool. And it's also worth a mention that cultivating a relationship with the plants is also relevant here, because knowing what plants produce what colors and in what amounts, with what additives and mordants, comes with such a rich history of study and experimentation. So then you have the combining of colors and textures in the spinning of a yarn. The preparation of the fiber itself affects the finished yarn. How you card and blend fibers can change the feel or the hand of the yarn. And only after all of those moving parts come together do we have a yarn with such impeccable attention to detail that we can finally start to think about how the shape, the fit, the drape, the textures, and the colors are all going to come together in a garment. I believe that the reason that knitting is relegated to being a craft is because of the arbitrary definitions of what is considered fine art and what is not. These definitions were set in a time when what is now considered fine arts were dominated by white men. White men made the rules and they set the standards, and art was made to be purchased by wealthy white men. The applied arts or crafts are made up of mostly women, people from the lower classes, and in some cases enslaved people. And the reason that textile work is undervalued is because under colonial white supremacist patriarchy, these people are undervalued. But these are the people who make culture, who create everyday objects that everyone uses. Today, we're talking about knitting, the textiles, the very garments that we put on our bodies, one of the most intimate relationships that we have with our things. If clothing doesn't shape culture, it certainly reflects it. And what we wear can be so personal to us, expressing, if we choose, the values of our being. They can be in the wearing and in the making, a source of joy and creativity, and they fulfill a practical need. Another reason why, among many, of why clothing isn't considered art is because it's been produced at a massive scale, exploiting workers and the planet at every step of the process, following trends that are constantly shifting to accommodate the consumer. I personally came to knitting through the path that I'm walking. in my effort to walk as lightly and as kindly as I can on this planet for this planet. And my passion for the textiles and sustainability collided in knitting. How I define sustainability is the desire to live in a good relationship with all of the living world around me. And I believe that being in relationship with the people, the planet, what we love and what we do, what we create, makes us accountable to act with integrity in those relationships. Knitting, slow fashion, and reclaiming the making of cloth into our own hands is art as expression, art as political statement, art in solidarity, art in aesthetic, and art in the way that as artists, we are remaking ourselves and our relationships to the clothes that we wear.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I'm really inspired by what you have to say. So our final speakers are Jenny Underwood and Leanne Zilka from RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. Using technology to extrude knitted fabric, Underwood and Zilka have literally taken knitting to new heights by incorporating it into architectural design. Welcome, Jenny and Leanne.
Thank you. And thank you for being allowing us to be part of this incredibly rich discussion. And firstly, I would like to say Womanjika to everyone. Leanne and I are coming today from Naarm, which is Melbourne, Australia. And we would like to acknowledge the ancestors past and present on whose unceded lands we are on. And we are on today the land of the Warhol and Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations. So I think there's a really nice synergy here between the University of Virginia and your mantra, and also, I guess, the journey that as Australians, we are working through in terms of our path towards reconciliation. So we do acknowledge that. So Leanne and I, for something quite different, and maybe we'll move to the next slide, and we work in quite a different way. So we are very much about looking at large-scale installations and thinking about what is the potential of a medium like knitting for architecture. And when we start to think of these really big questions and big issues that we have in the world, so particularly around climate change, the way we design our cities, how might we start to reimagine our cities? So I personally came to knitting completely by accident. I would never have imagined that I would have been interested or done anything to do with knitting. But I ended up studying textile design, and through that, I discovered knitting. And that really led me on a whole journey right through to particularly discovering the amazing ability of knitting, that through one stitch, you can create infinite possibilities. I also what I love about knitting is this relationship between being able to build a surface and a form all in one. And I think that's how I really met Leanne. We were looking at doing a collaborative studio around thinking about future speculative architecture. So Leanne, I'll get you to sort of introduce yourself too.
Thanks, Jenny. So the slides could probably just keep kind of rolling through, I guess. But this is an example of a really large scale. So I suppose we're at that point where we've successfully translated a drawing in an architectural program and then popped it through as a digital program into the industrial knitting machines. So I guess that's where it's obvious where the collaboration is actually scaling up these things. And as an architect, we want to do things that are spatial. And I think for me, I've come to knitting just because fibres have such a range. They're much more sophisticated than building materials. So, of course, there's the walls and the acrylics that we're seeing with our fantastic panel, but there are also, fibres that absorb energy. There's carbon fibres, there's Dyneema yarns, there's lots of technical yarns that make cars go really fast and that makes planes fly. So, they are already at the scale of architecture, and they take a lot more force than any building products that, we're sort of familiar with. And so what the questions are, like, what if we use those at a large scale? Like, what if they become, used in the building of architecture? How can our cities respond a little bit better to climate change? Can we have, really intelligent buildings that are giving us data as well as harvesting sun and supporting plant life? So once you start getting into the fibre world, you're really opening up lots and lots of opportunities. So the demonstrations that we're showing now are really kind of pushing the knitting technology to the limit. And showing extreme complexity in form. So saying that, like, we can do this now, doesn't get more complex than that. In fact, a shoulder joint in a sweater is probably the most complex set of junctions that you'll ever get in architecture, far more complex. And the way that fashion and textile deal with form is sometimes much more sophisticated than what we can do in architecture with, stiff sheet-based materials. Jen, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I think I guess another thing in terms of our process has been we've been collaborating for over 10 years. So we've been really interested in looking at how the intersection between multiple different types of technologies. So when you start to look at an industrial knitting machine, it's all based on code. So one stitch equals 1 pixel. So then you start to design in pixels, and then looking at how does that work when we look at architectural software. So that's allowed us to find some really nice connections between what we call parametric design. So when we start to look at what are the limitations of a knitting machine, if you think of the bed width is the first one, but you can knit potentially as long as you need it to be. So that's when we start to look at those relationships between different software. And one of our areas of, once you start to think about the scale of a building, is the need to try and find ways in which you can automate those processes. So much of the work is done at the design stage, and then how that translates through to the knitting machine. And an example of that is probably, if we start to look at the next slide, is, this is a project that we did last year. And these are really large scale installations and starting to show what you can achieve in terms of extreme form and that relationship between surface and form, and how all of those different components can start to come together. I guess one of the things with knitting is that you can be incredibly playful with colour, and it's one of those joyous moments. But underlining all of this are some really serious concerns in terms of trying to address issues and thinking about what are the sort of byproducts of a fashion system, such as the choice of materials and yarns that are being used in that system that may not really be designed really for one-off wear in garment or for the body. Could it actually be diverted into another area, so such as architecture?
I'm just aware of the time, so I'm happy to, this, maybe we'll just conclude with this slide, which is sort of a simulation of a retrofit. So in Australia now, there's less and less appetite to demolish. In fact, developers can get up to $1 million in penalties for demolishing. So finally, the retrofit or the reuse is a real conversation and not one that is more expensive. And with that, obviously we've got tons of facades that are, you know, reliant on very, very carbon heavy mechanical systems. So how can we retrofit lightweight knitted fibres that are intelligent as a way to kind of mitigate this climate disaster we're heading straight into?
Thank you so much, Jenny and Leanne. That's wonderful food for thought and for our discussion. So we're going to jump into some questions. And, you know, I was going to ask about process and technology, but many of you covered that so well in your presentations. I really am attracted to some of the things that Lauren was saying about the kind of the social and cultural aspects of knitting, you know, even the emotional aspects of knitting, you know, the sensory, you know, response to yarns. And so I wanted us to maybe jump into talking about, you know, what does knitting mean? What does it mean to people, to, you know, how people respond to it? And I'd be interested in hearing from each of you on that. Who wants to start? Lauren, you start. How about you start?
Okay. Well, I thought I knew what knitting meant until a second ago during your introduction, and I just realized that my mind was like opened up to a new idea of what knitting can mean. Thinking about the textiles in architecture, and I had these thoughts of like how many other fibers are there? Like, I know there's a fiber out there that can convert solar energy, right? Like, why aren't we putting these on buildings? And like, I'm sure that's something that y'all are thinking about. And so my mind was completely blown when you were talking about that. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. The question was, what does knitting mean? I think for me, it really comes down to the relationship that I have with my clothing, and the relationship. I'm thinking about relationship in all aspects of my life, but specifically, I am passionate about fabric and clothing, and so getting into as close of a relationship as I can with my clothing. So to me, that's, you know, can I know the farmer where the fiber comes from? Can I know the soil where these animals grew up? You know, and just the act of knitting. If you're a knitter yourself, you know that it's very personal to create your own garment. And so at every step of the process, there's an aspect of relationship. And to me, I love it so much. I want to be in relationship with it as much as I can. And so I just get as close as I can in relationship.
Does anybody else want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in real quick and say that you know, knitting has truly become the biggest part of my life, you know, and the fact that you can just take a piece of string and turn it into something that you can wear, as Lauren mentioned, it surprises me. So, you know, when I'm designing, if I'm designing a scarf, a hat, a dress, you know, I'm so, you know, I think of stepping outside the box. You know, I put together, back right before the pandemic, we put together a fashion show in New York City for Vogue Knitting Live. And they had asked me to, you know, to run this show. And I said, if we do this, we do it my way. And what I wanted was, all the you know, the designers to not just think of yarn being the only medium, right? We had people submit pieces that were made of complete wire. A woman made an entire dress in wire. And when I saw that, it just blew my mind, and how you can use anything. I've seen people take plastic bags and recycle them and turn them into garments, into rugs. I've seen people take t-shirts and strip it down to to yarn, like just string and just knit it in a complete carpet. It blows my mind what you can do with knitting. And so, I think a lot of us in the industry are starting to move towards that and say, well, where can I take this how can I take this to the next level? And so, I'm excited to be doing the next fashion show again, and we're taking it the next step. So each year that we do this, I set these guidelines and say, all right, I want you to think of even wood. Who knows what we can use? Cork, anything. I've seen people knit spaghetti. So it's really interesting to see, how we can take knitting to the next level. And I love that connection that it gives us all. We all have a different take on knitting.
Speaking of taking it to the next level, I think that's a real good entree for Althea. Because, okay, your garments aren't worn, but they're certainly appreciated and they really mean something to people. So I don't know if you can expand on that, on why people connect with them so much, besides just the proficiency of doing them.
Well, I think that I think when people look at the stuff that I make, they do, a lot of the questions revolve around, how is it done? Kind of the wonderment factor. I think that for me, being able to use my hands and do something incredibly detailed and time consuming is very gratifying. When I go to museums and I look at things that people used to make, and people still do, but when you see things that people really put a lot of time and effort into out of the love of doing it, it's kind of magical. For me, just the process of knitting is just very therapeutic. It's comforting. I love troubleshooting. I like inventing and discovering new things. And I find that with knitting, it really truly has an infinite amount of possibilities. And as I continue, the thing about what I do is I don't think I can physically do it until I'm, 95, if I live that long. My hands are more sore. My back hurts more now, so it's more difficult for me to do that kind of thing, but I'll do it as long as I can.
Wonderful. So what about you, Jenny and Leanne? I think that, putting knitting in architecture, so, how do people respond to that? What does it connote for people?
I think the discussion so far has really captured a few those key words around connection. So many people have a connection to knitting, and I think there's a really personal connection. Quite often people who see our work, because it's at such a different scale to what they're used to when they're seeing knitting, but they can relate it back to a personal story. And it's a story around family or friendship, someone who's made something for them. And I think it's that connection between what you see as an outcome, whether it's incredibly miniature, whether it's for the body or away from the body, but there's something social in that, because people understand what the process and the care that goes into making and crafting a piece, regardless of what that is. And while Leanne and I work with industrial knitting machines, it's still a very embodied process. You need to understand the physicalities of what knitting is about. You need to understand, I guess, its own logic. People have, we talk about the mathematics of knitting. It has its own inherent logic that it takes a knitter to understand what that is. But it can also be incredibly playful. And I think that's where, when you start to see examples such as craft activism, it can invite people into a conversation that wouldn't otherwise be had.
Maybe I'll just jump in and also say, it's so funny because for me, the test is, does it look too much like craft? So I'm always testing it against these because it is so emotive, the knit structure itself, it's really hard to take people's imagination away from the knit itself and into what else it could be. And so when we do little prototypes, the big conversation is, does it look a bit too much like craft? Is it too handmade looking? So it's kind of, it's a sort of a struggle because it's so loaded. The fibres themselves, the knit structure itself is so loaded. But also I was going to say with Althea's work, and I was thinking like, they're really beautiful things. Like I would love to see them big. But then again, they actually defy gravity. So if you were to have that kind of as a large scale thing, you just would never get that because they're almost suspended they're so light, but actually they're really dense. So it's actually, as photos, without your hand there to deceive the scale, it's actually a fascinating structure that you have kind of developed. And, the aesthetic of it is absolutely gorgeous.
Let me just expand on one of those things that you all brought up about kind of the social aspect of knitting, creating community and seeking out community. And so, I mean, I found that as a knitter, and I think that others have as well. So who do you, is it, well, Althea, is it solitary for you, or do you have a community of knitters that you work with?
It's pretty solitary, but then again, I'm a fairly solitary person. When I first started, the community that I went to were the knitting shops. That's if I needed to learn, I was always seeking out more of a challenge. So when I needed to learn how to use colors, all different colors, I'd hop on over to the knitting store. But other than the knitting that I've done, like the larger scale community projects, it's really mostly on my own. Sometimes I'll actually take it on an airplane and do it, out in the world if I'm traveling. But there are other people that knit at small scale. And in the beginning, they were great about, teaching me what kinds of threads were good to use. Because of course, I first started, I actually was like, okay, what are the tiniest needles, which were just like, 0 needles and baby weight yarn, and I made like a little sweater, and it was terrible, but it sparked something in me. And it was just a constant exploration.
Louis, you talked a little bit about community and about how knitting really is changing. The face of knitting is changing. Do you want to elaborate on some of your community of knitters?
It really is. I can say we're starting to see a lot more younger knitters emerging, especially during the pandemic. We saw a boost in knitters and crocheters and just fiber artists, people creating businesses surrounding fiber. And, I realized that, we're starting to see a trend happening where, you're seeing more men knitting, you're seeing children knitting. I get so excited every time I would walk into my local yarn shop and I see kids sitting at the table learning how to knit, and it excites me because that's the next generation, right? And that's the way I look at it. And so, any opportunity I get to teach kids how to knit, or I can go into a school and talk to them about fiber, and especially for young boys, right? And we live, depending on where you live, I grew up in a family, in a culture, I should say, that boys are supposed to do one thing and girls are supposed to do another thing, do one thing. And knitting wasn't one of those things that boys were supposed to do in my family, in my culture, right? And so, it was about breaking down those barriers and breaking down those walls and saying, well, here I am, I knit, I'm a guy, and it's okay. And I extend that to children, especially, children that are coming into their age. So we're talking about 10, 12 years old, and, they're trying to figure out what they're good at. And, whether it's sports, whether it's singing or acting or crafting, whatever it is, I always tell them, I go into a school and I'll tell them, whatever it is, try it. You may like it. And if not, then you go on and you move on to the next thing. And I love telling, especially children, that, you know, that message, right? And so now we're seeing, like I said, we're seeing a boost in young people just knitting, and I love it. I really do.
I know teaching is really important to Lauren as well. I've seen that on your site, and also that you specifically design your patterns to help people expand their knitting techniques and to have their personal expression. Do you want to elaborate on a little bit about what your philosophy is about teaching knitting?
So when I design a pattern, I want my garments to fit people the way that they want their garments to fit. So my patterns are based on measurement. I write down the process that I do when I'm making my garments. Take the measurement of whoever I'm making it for, and then I come up with the algebraic equation. So anyone can plug in their specific measurements and then create it at whatever scale they want to. You know, with an algebraic equation, you could do micro knitting, or you could do it on a massive scale as well, as long as you have the measurements. And it's my greatest joy when someone who's purchased my pattern or downloaded my pattern comes to me and says, hey, this part of the pattern isn't working for this part of my body. I'm going to do this instead. You know, I'm going to create more short rows here, or I'm going to cinch in the waist here, or I'm going to stop knitting here. Whatever it is, if it is different than what I wrote down, I'm just ecstatic because someone is making it to fit their personal body in the way that they want it to fit. And I'm not attached to someone doing it the exact way that I wrote it down. So that's my greatest joy. It's when someone tells me they don't want to follow my pattern.
So do we want to maybe get to a couple of questions in the Q&A, Lisa? Would you like to
Sure.
pose a couple of those?
Yeah. So there was a question it's directed to for all the panelists to answer, but Lauren in particular. They are asking if you can expand on how knitting as a practice philosophically aligns with complex yet important topics such as abolitionism, social justice, and environmental justice. So this sounds like someone who's maybe read your website.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, I am really happy to talk about this like offline, but I will say that the specific way, and just because this is the way that I do it does not mean it's the only way. I think that, you know, individually we know a little, but together we know a lot. So in my personal practice, the way I practice anarchism is to be in relationship. And that is in relationship to people, to the land, to everything that I'm doing. And I think that relationship is what makes us accountable to one another. And when you're truly in a loving relationship with whatever you're doing or who you're relating with, you care about how that affects. You care about what you do and how that affects other beings. So in relation to knitting and making clothing, it's taking, reclaiming the act of making cloth for ourselves and being, like I said, in relationship to it as much as possible, and being aware of how every decision that you're making affects everyone around you.
Thank you. And Did anyone else have anything that they want to add to that? All right. Well, there is another question.
Jenny might.
Oh, Jenny, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think Lauren has, she's spoken beautifully about that. And I think, you know, increasingly at this time in the world, that sense of relationship with land, with people, with what we do, and the footprint that we leave, I think is so critical. So I think that's where a medium like knitting does offer a way to think differently about how do we work? How do we relate to each other?
Thank you for adding that, Jenny. I know I personally can say I think differently about knitting now. There is another question here for all the panelists. And since we're getting close to needing to wrap things up, I do want to put this question out to anyone who would like to address it. Has there ever been a time in your life when you felt like you needed to validate knitting as an art form or part of a movement? When was that, and what was that like for you?
I mean, I will say I've knit in movements, you know, pussy hats and kudzu and other things. It wasn't to validate knitting as an art form. It was to, you know, express something political through something I could make. I mean, I'm not sure really how to answer that question, but I do think there's just knitting conveys some really strong cultural and social, I don't know, you know, it touches people, right?
I know that I've spoken a lot, and I want to, if Louis, you wanted to address this, I heard you say earlier about how, like the racism in the knitting community.
Yeah.
And when this question came up, immediately in my mind, it wasn't validate myself or validate knitting as an art form, but like validate myself as a knitter in this space with the way that it looks. And I know that you said that earlier. So
yeah, and so that's why I was trying to find a good way of coming into that. What I will say is that, you know, we've been seeing a lot of, you know, there's so much I can go into this, but we've been through the past, I would say the last 3 years, we've been seeing a lot of people, you know, offending one another, you know, people, you know, saying, well, I've heard comments like, you know, do Black people, I see Black people knit? Of course they knit. You know, we've heard stories over and over and over again on how marginalized people in this industry are not being acknowledged, are not being paid properly. You know, I can tell you right now, as a Puerto Rican knitwear designer, you know, I'm constantly working 3 times as hard to try to get to that same level as someone who's a white designer who I don't have, you know, they put out a design and it's like, whoa, here we go. And, you know, I look, you know, it's not about, you know, judging anybody's, you know, way of designing. It's not about that. But I've seen some amazing, amazing BIPOC designers that are not getting, you know, the attention that they deserve. And that to me is probably where we are right now. Is like, how do we elevate them to that level where they're making just as much money as many white designers in this industry, right? And I talk about this all the time. We talk about, are we properly paying everyone on the same level? You know, how are companies, you know, sourcing their designers to design for them, for their companies and the yarns that they produce? You know, so on my end, what I work on is, you know, I make sure that I'm including my people. I'm including BIPOC designers. I'm constantly creating these platforms for them where if I can't do it, I'm going to help somebody else. And I always talk about that, right? And you know, I'm always looking for not the well-known designers. I'm looking for the designers that are just coming onto the scene. Those are the designers that I'm looking for. And that to me is where the real work starts, right? So, you know, we have a lot of companies. We have a lot of, you know, indie dyers out there that are emerging. And I've seen some beautiful yarns being produced. That in itself is art, you know, and to see that, you know, they're cutting their prices down because, you know, oh well, I don't want to pay that much for a skein of yarn, you know, and that to me is ridiculous. I know what it takes to create colorways. Even myself, I've tested it out, I've tried it, and I'm like, this is too much work for me. I cannot do this. But I tip my hat to all these artists that are not getting the attention that they need because they're working so hard, and they have to work 3 times as hard. And so that's where, you know, this conversation comes into play a lot. You know, I'm going on to another panel tomorrow specifically talking about this, you know, because, you know, we talk about, you know, making our own table. We talk about this a lot, right? If there's no space at that table, guess what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna make my own table, and I'm gonna invite everybody in. And that's what we need to do more of. That's what we need to see in this industry, and supporting one another, you know. And that's I think that's where we need to start shifting in this industry, is just creating those spaces and the availability and the opportunities for these designers.
So, Louis, I have to read this comment, and before we wrap it up, and I think this is a beautiful way to end this. This was typed by one of the panelists, Will, who says, this is for Louis. Connecting to what Louis said, I'm a 19-year-old guy who knits. I started knitting because I saw a video of him knitting and talking about how it is for both genders. Because of him, I have been knitting for 5 years and I absolutely love it. Thank you, Louis, for inspiring me and many other knitters.
Wow. I thank you, Will. That I can't even tell you how much that means to me. And I got goosebumps all over my body because it's those stories that we don't know about as knitters, right? And this is, and I'm so glad he brought this up because this just leads into something that's so dear to my heart. And I'm going to share a really quick story. But there was a young lady, I cannot remember the name for the life of me, but she had read my story, and she said that her father, her late father had, who was an avid knitter, he loved making sweaters. He made like so many sweaters. And she remembered how much he loved it. And then she read my story, and he passed away like 5 years before she read my story. And she said that it was so inspiring that she picked up knitting, and she now knits in his honor. And it's those stories that we hear, and it's you know, there's we talked about connection today, right? And how we connect to knitting, and you know, we all have a story to tell, you know. And I tell everybody's story. Everybody's journey is completely different, you know. My journey is not going to be the same as Lauren's or as Althea's. You know, we all have something to put into this industry, right? And it's about, what are you going to do with your craft? What are you going to do with your abilities? And how are you going to take that and turn it into something much bigger than yourself? And I think that's what knitting means the most to me, is taking my love of the craft and just bringing it out into the world and bringing others in. And I think that's what all of us need to do, you know, especially at a time like this. You know, we're all under stress. We're all dealing with something in our lives, but there is such a sense of pride. There is such a reward when you can take that love of knitting or crafting, whatever it is that you're doing out there, and just give it back, and just watch what happens when you start planting those little seeds.
Well, I think that's a wonderful message to end on. I know that the knitters, the hardcore knitters, are still with us, and they would stay with us for another hour to hear this discussion. I could certainly talk to you all evening, but it's been a fabulous discussion, and it's taken us in many interesting directions, and I would like to keep it going. And if you haven't already, you can check out the other Art and Life programs on Kluge-Ruhe's YouTube channel on a variety of interesting topics. A big thank you to all of our panelists and to everyone who attended the event tonight. Have a great night.